So I thought I'd switch things up a little bit today and become Jimmy Neutron. Anyway, if you're a fan of minimal, boring, and overall just tasteless design, I think the Sony Xperia Z3 is one that might fit your fancy. Sony haven't really changed much about their design language for the past few years, and the Sony Z3 follows a lot of the design cues that the modern Sony phones follow as well. And for an absolute steal of around £70 to £80, with a build quality and set of features as good as this one, it's kind of difficult to pass up. So hey guys, my name is Ryan Thomas with Failtech, and this is the Sony Xperia Z3 in 2018 and beyond. Let's talk about that chassis first and what it features. So first, flanking that 5.2 inch 1080p IPS display, which we'll get onto in a little bit, are a pair of speakers. They're pretty good. They're fairly minimal and part of the design that kind of make it really understated. They're not as big and as standoutish as something like Boom Sound on the 1M7 or even Motorola's Nexus 6. However, they are loud, they're clear, and they're on the front, and they're a stereo pair, which is excellent in my opinion. The display itself is good. It's a 5.2 inch panel, so it might not fit everyone's hands, but it's fairly good and fairly small in the majority of cases. The bezels are fairly big though, although you do get those speakers, so that's pretty cool, although the buttons are on screen, so it do take up a little bit of screen real estate. The screen is sharp, it's fairly vibrant, it's not as punchy as an AMOLED, but it's definitely got some excellent colours to it, very accurate as well, and I think the display is actually one of the better features of the phone. There are flaps on the side that enable the IP68 water and dust resistance, which is an excellent feature of this phone to have, by the way, because the build quality is just so stunning with its metal and glass finish, just absolutely stunning. So with the IP68 water and dust resistance, it does add a level of almost utilitarian design to it, but at the same time keeps a fairly elegant looking design at the same time. The flaps are something that obviously we've seen go in modern IP68 phones, but I feel like it's not that bad of a trade-off because unlike the Galaxy S5, it kind of blends into the design, and because of course there is no removable back, you do have to have the flaps for the micro SD card as well as the charging port. The overall design is fairly boring, and so I don't think it's one of those phones that was very targeted for being stolen, but at the same time it just has to fit your fancy. Again, it's more of a preference thing. I think the build quality is definitely up to scratch. The dated Snapdragon 801 isn't exactly the best chip, and it's not exactly the most optimum way to enjoy your content or enjoy your phone, but an 801 is definitely not bad, and with 3GB of RAM, that's an excellent amount of RAM to go with that chip, especially for a phone of this age, which around this time most phones had 2GB of RAM, so 3GB is definitely nice to see. You get 16 or 32GB of storage, which for a lot of people just isn't enough, and in my opinion 32GB is the bare minimum that you want in a phone nowadays. However, like I said before, you do get micro SD expansion, so you can expand that, although it's kind of difficult to install apps on your micro SD card because of just the limitations of the interface itself. The Adreno 330 can struggle when playing some 3D titles, but playing 2D titles is just fine, and browsing social media and basically the things you do with kind of a used phone work just great with the Adreno 330, and I'm glad they didn't go with a QHD screen because I believe that the system on the chip as a whole might suffer a little bit when going and powering a QHD screen, so 1080p is definitely a good resolution for this system. The 6.0 Marshmallow skin isn't too heavy and it's fairly modern. It's not the most modern, but as with most Sonys, you can go and just install your own custom ROMs, and a lot of people do. Android has come a long way since KitKat 4.4.4, which is the OS that this phone had on it when it first came out, and I feel like we've made a lot of changes in the Android space itself. Of course, the overall design and look and finish of Android has changed, but also the functionality. You know, we're using fewer widgets than we were before, and we're going more into applications, and a lot of multitasking is going on nowadays. So I feel like this phone with its 3GB of RAM is almost a good partner for the newer software because it can hold a decent amount of RAM. The Z3 at first, when I first saw it back in the day, blew me away with its camera. A 20 megapixel sensor or near enough with f2.0 glass, and of course it can shoot UHD video. Now this was the first phone I ever looked at that could shoot UHD video, and I was stunned at just how much you could zoom in and retain detail. And at the same time, it was the first phone I checked out that actually could do 720p slow motion at 120 FPS, which is another thing that this thing can do. The one thing that I have to say about this camera is it doesn't have optical image stabilization. That, coupled with its fairly slow glass and of course that really pixel dense sensor, is something that translates to not amazing low light performance. Now also, Sony cameras do like to over sharpen, and it's something that I've seen a lot with this phone. What I have to say is that 20 megapixels is a large sensor with like definitely a lot of pixels, so why over sharpen upon that? I feel like it's just a little bit too overkill, and you can change it with some editing, but mainly it's just best to shoot in RAW and just do the main effects after. But the two-step shutter button is just fantastic. It's a similar one that you'd find on like a point and shoot camera, and it's just really nice to have. I don't understand why more phones don't have it. Even by today's standards, in decent conditions, this camera is just great. It's not Pixel level, it's not Pixel 2 level of course, but it's definitely not bad. It's one that I would consider as to be a great camera phone for the money. In fact, it's probably better than most point and shoot cameras for the money. Now, the 2.2 megapixel selfie shooter, that's pretty bad. 2.2 megapixels, at the start is just not that good. It can shoot 1080p video of course, because 1080p is about 1.95 megapixels, but the camera isn't sharp and it doesn't feature a wide angle lens, so there really isn't a good reason to go with this phone if you're really into your selfies. 3100 mAh battery is pretty good. It's not huge, but it's definitely bigger than some phones, like for example the Galaxy S8 is a much larger phone, but features an almost same size battery at 3300 mAh. The Z3 with its 3100 mAh cell is pretty good, and I feel like gets you through most of the day. The 801 is kind of power hungry, but it's definitely not as bad as something like an 810, so I would feel like you could get through a full day if you really wanted to. Now the fact that it's an IPS display means it's not the most efficient, however I feel like if you're paying like the 70 to 80 pounds for this phone, you're not really power using your phone, so it would definitely get you through a full day. But for me, it's just slightly shy of a full day. Now the micro USB port for charging is a little bit dated. You don't get wireless charging at all, but you only get fast charging if you buy the Japanese model. If you've just got a European or US model, you won't get the fast charging at all, which is funny. Despite the glass back, no wireless charging, but there we go. My overall thoughts are that this is a solid buy for £80, 70 to £80. It gives you an excellent array of features, however you don't get a fingerprint scanner, the selfie shooter's a little bit poor, and the battery, whilst it's okay, could be a bit bigger I feel, especially with the chunky design. This is a phone that I feel is a solid buy. It's one of those ones where I don't necessarily want to go out my way to advertise it and say this is the best phone ever, but at the same time if someone came to me and said, well, what do you think about the Z3? I'd say it's a pretty solid phone. It's not one that I personally would have, and that's just due to the fact it doesn't have a fingerprint scanner, but apart from that, there are some really good details about this phone, and I feel like a lot of you are going to like it because you can customize it so much. Anyway, that's it from me guys, a solid recommendation from me at FailTech. Please do like or dislike this video and comment and subscribe if you're new around here so never miss a video like this one. Thank you to Ross Baldwin and Jay Brown for supporting me on Patreon. Go and support me on Patreon if you really want to. From Jimmy Neutron over at FailTech, go and follow my social media. I've been Jimmy Neutron with FailTech, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.